Thank you so much. I feel very honored to be included in your group here because of, a northerner coming into the great south of the Crown. That's fantastic. What a fantastic conference also that you guys have put together. I've just learned so much over the last several days, incredible amounts of material. Today, I'd like to share a short paper that I've prepared with one current graduate student, Muhi, and my student who's just graduated and looking for a job, Farshid Mirzaalian. We together have interested in the topic of how do we support discussions and dialogue with tourists and recreationists who are visiting mountain environments. Over the years, maybe the past decade or so, we've done a lot of work in the mountain parks in Banff and Jasper in particular. And not unlike other operators all over the world, tourism operators are kind of reticent to start this conversation with their clients about the importance of climate change. And it's even, isn't a real phenomenon, number one, but number two is tourism's role in this phenomenon and impacting the planet we live on. So I wanted to try to understand this a bit more and how we can help park agencies, land managers, and also the tourism operators who are using these contexts to have these conversations, these difficult conversations with tourists that they're serving. So attitudes towards climate change, going to touch on that and some of the research we've done around that in terms of parks visitors' perceptions of these things. And then some of the best practice that have been documented by especially other social scientists working in sort of behavioral approaches to encouraging climate change action. So I won't dwell on this slide or these topics because I think we've talked about this before in a number of other really excellent presentations throughout this week. But also, I guess last year you also had a focus on fires for the special topic. But we know that climate change has tremendous impacts on recreational opportunities in the mountain parks. We have safety to humans, not just from wildfires, but flooding. We have also the financial impacts to the viability of small and medium-sized enterprises who are engaged in trying to deliver recreation and tourism opportunities. And of course, we have biodiversity implications. So I thought maybe I should start with just a bit of a national comparison. So some trends, and these are just big macro surveys that we see attitudes of, in this case, Americans. This was documented pre-pandemic. These are the Americans who believe that global warming will be a somewhat serious issue for the United States and the world. And you can see that's just kind of staying around the same, maybe increasing slightly. A similar comparison in Canada here, you can see my home province of Alberta. This is a less of a concerning issue for Albertans than maybe some of the rest of the parts of the province or the country, I should say. If the market you're interested, the tourism market you're interested in is from British Columbia, certainly they're more attuned to this issue and maybe more accepting or willing to listen to conversations about it as a tourist. And then one other, this is again from, a Pew Foundation, another source, sorry. I'll just highlight here, is it personally important to these respondents? So in the general population, the black line in the US, there's an increasing rise in this issue of global warming. So I'm mentioning some of these things as just saying, what's the appetite of audiences to listen and talk about these conversations when they're on vacation? And so you can see some of these similar questions in the Canadian context. And again, this is pre-pandemic kind of surveying. I think we're starting to see a slightly different trend post-pandemic as people have been isolated and sitting in their homes and seeing things like the heat wave phenomenon that we experienced last year here on the west coast of North America. So this is the appetite, maybe the level of appetite to have conversations as tourists when they're vacationing. And in particular, I also wanted just to share this from the Pew Foundation. So they've been focusing in on more of a comparison of the different generational groups. And of course, we know that Gen Z and the millennials have been bombarded with messaging about the impact of climate change on the planet that they will be inheriting and living in. And so they are much more concerned about this than maybe some of the other markets. So again, I'm starting to think about this from a marketing perspective and what target market would be most interested in having conversations about this, and which target market is really thinks that this is a really important topic. So it's our next market. It's the markets that are starting to come to our parks and have more spending dollars in for our tourism hotels in these regions. So this is just a hypothetical pie chart that I kind of put together. On average, we're seeing about 30% of the population in both Canada and the United States are sort of starting to think, what actions can I be taking as a household to engage in climate change action? About 30% are sort of aware that this is an issue, but they're not really taking a daily engagement in action. And then maybe about 25% are just sort of off there still. They're not either believers, or they don't really think that they can have an impact, or they don't care. There's a lot of different elements that sit in that gray zone. So if I think about this, how do we reach out to the folks? Well, let me go back to a minute. How do we reach out to the folks that really care and are taking action? Because that's always the best way forward, is to take the converted audience and support their efforts. And then how do we convert the group in the orange segment? How do we move them into action? How do we give them the tools to be successful in engaging in climate change? And so we dug into this a bit more, and one of the projects we did was we examined visitors to the Rocky Mountain Parks, and we drilled down specifically in this data that I'm sharing with you today to Jasper National Park. And we asked them, what are their perceptions of climate change impacts on their visitor experience? And we didn't ask them directly. A little bit like Will was just talking about, we used big data to explore this. So those of you who are, I'm sure you're all familiar with the product that Jasper National Park has to offer, typical kind of mountain environments, but it also has this really accessible, large Columbia ice fields, and especially the Athabasca Glacier as a tourism attraction, which ice buggies drive up to and take tourists right onto the glacier. So it's very accessible. A high portion of international tourists come to this destination. But what we wanted to do, we stepped back here, and what we did was we extracted reviews by tourists from all way back from the beginning of TripAdvisor to October 2019. We have generated over 17,000 posts that had any mention of the terms, that was in total, that focused on reviews of this glacier and the larger trip experience to Jasper. And then we broke it. We told the computer, the software, we just told them, go search for terms or phrases or reviews that talk about climate change related things. So global warming, wildfires, visibility troubles. You can see the kind of the terms we use. We ended up with 982 reviews that we had to read through and look at the context in which they were talking about climate change related stuff. And we just kind of broke it into different themes. And I'm just going to share a couple of these themes with you today, just not to dwell on these findings, because you can actually, we can have this report ready for you if you wish. So we saw people concerned and emotionally concerned when they were visiting this park about the disappearance of snow-capped mountains, about the disappearance of glaciers in particular. And you can see from this quote, it evokes this idea that you guys have all heard of before, this kind of last chance tourism. I've got to go see this glacier before it disappears. And you've seen this on the front lines at Glacier National Park as well. But they also evoke this feeling of awe. We also saw people talking about, they're kind of really concerned about the lack of corporate social responsibility demonstrated by maybe the tour operator they were traveling with. And they also paired this actually with Parks Canada, so that the signage that was available at the site and throughout the park experience, they had comments about, why aren't they talking about climate change directly? I see nothing talking about humans' role in climate change. So interpretive signage, as well as the corporate responsibility demonstrated by the operator that they were traveling with on that particular buggy tour. And so how can we help those commercial entities and also maybe the park agency, the parent, but message more effectively around this, and maybe with diverse messaging that reaches different audiences. A third example, now this is wildfires. So of course, again, I don't need to dwell on this because you all know how the importance of wildfires and how it kind of reduces the overall visitor experience at different points during the summer period. And we'll increasingly face that as the phenomenon. And then finally, we had a lot of we saw a lot of postings around senses of guilt, acknowledgement of the glacier retreat, this uncertainty of the future, and actually reflected in these travel postings because of their interaction, particularly with the glacier, and they saw how it's retreated so much over the past century. So the park has done a great job at sort of interpreting that, because you can see how far the glacier has disappeared. But then you have people's expression of shame, of depression, of denial, or acceptance, and wanting to do more. So we've teased out these themes, and it kind of aligns with some of the thought, thinking about other theorists who kind of study a lot more about climate change and climate grief. So giving that as a data set, we try to understand what are people's reactions to their visitor experience. And we tried to figure out, well, what can we do differently, and how can we support this? And I dug a little bit more, instead of just the general population kind of survey work. I referenced this particular survey of US adults in 2019 and their willingness to engage in certain travel behaviors that might mitigate their impacts on the environment. So you can see here, 41% will consciously choose to visit a destination off season, again, dealing with some of the crowding issues, and booking environmentally friendly hotels. Some of these percentages seem to be consistent with about the 30% of the population that's really willing and currently taking action to engage in climate change action. Does travel seem to help with climate change? Interestingly, there's very few people who noted in these surveys, this survey in particular, that they regretted taking a trip, that they think that's largely a positive impact. Travel is largely a positive impact. And not a lot of them were making a connection between their travel to this destination and potential implications for the climate or maybe wildlife as well that they're visiting. So I just put this here because I'm trying to narrow our focus to tourists in particular, and think about, well, what can we leverage? What can we change in terms of how we talk to them and give them opportunities to take action, maybe when they are a tourist. And this is all driven by this idea that we can no longer talk to just the converted. We need to start thinking, how do we build a bigger tent about this conversation about climate change? And so I initially, that 30% of people who are aware and already taking action, well, that's great. But how do we broaden the tent to bring in the next 35% of folks into this conversation and enable success? I think I'm going to almost run out of time here, so let me just focus on this. What can we do in terms of an overarching sort of look at what's been previously successful? We can help them overcome some cognitive dissonance, which means that helping them learn about their own beliefs and overcome, sorry, I'm going to skip this. This is too much. I'm going to just move on to the next two slides and I can get back to that. I want to just switch to this for a minute. What we did, back to our context again, is to again go to the Jasper context. One of the main providers is Pursuit Adventures. So a commercial operator, we use their script, the script that they give to their tourists as they drive up to the glacier and back down again. And this is an experimental design. And we simulated this, we rolled the script out in an experimental design where we it was millennials that we did in a lab experiment. And we delivered the normal script to one group, the control group, and an augmented script to the other group. And the augmented script, it contained additional information about climate change, humans' impacts in it, but also then calls to action and how you can do something small and personally that they can personally engage in. And this is trying to address this concern that operators have that they don't want to engage in this conversation because they think it'll just induce a sense of guilt or a sense of depression or just detract from the visitor's experience. But this is Muhi's study, and she found that it actually enriched the output, the experience of the the potential tourist that was listening to the script be that the climate change enhanced script also produced higher levels of satisfaction. So, you know, that's interesting. And you can say, critique this and say that this is a lab-based design where you're just basically reading a description and giving they're reading a description and getting a sense of, you know, the context, but really it's not the live kind of performance. And that's true. So we should actually roll this out in a field experiment next. But what seemed to work in this, just based on debriefing, is place-based conversation. So capitalizing on the context and when we can actually deliver or point out to a tourist where changes have happened, be upbeat and have a lot of positive messaging in the interpretive scripts or the messaging that you're using. Include facts that enrich the tourist experience. Those tourists who want to learn or be educated will take those facts with them. And always include personal strategies that they can engage in as individuals. Why we think it worked? Because it was educated audience and the millennials, so they're much more willing to listen to those conversations. I think I'm right on the 20-minute mark. Am I? How am I doing it? I think I ran out of time, so.
That's okay. Go ahead and take a minute to wrap up, Elizabeth.
Okay. I'll take my takeaways would be just in terms of my goal here today was just to throw out some of the in environmental communications right now, we're really starting to get some traction on some key ideas on what to include in messaging, either in person, in signage, in brochures, in social media messaging. Is that the positive tone, use of images, evoking emotions. So we're seeing that emotions are evoking feelings in your tourists or recreationists is really important. And then marrying that with an intention or action that you're encouraging them to do. Aligning them with their belief system. So for example, people who tend to be more conservative and maybe not as willing to embrace climate change ideas, definitely are aligned with more authority kind of focused messaging, and they seem to align or listen to that a bit more. Place-based messaging, and most importantly, I think two other things here. The acknowledgement that it's not just the tourist's responsibility. And I think that would be my takeaway message today. And I get inundated by that because I work a lot in environmental behavior, which is very individually focused. But we need to also think about it as a tripartite effort. It's government, policy, and regulation. It's operators being involved in this and being true partners in it. And then it's the tourist's responsibility too. And ensuring that the tourist understands that there's three parts to this process. Meaningful calls of action would be, keep it simple. So rather than saying, and this is not a climate change example, but end segregation today, it's rather than saying that, just the perfect slogan would be to don't ride the bus. So if you can convert that to a climate context, fantastic. And then finally, one last thing, and I'll end it there, is, you know, we want to support these messaging at site, of course, but pre-visit would be important in setting people's expectations before they arrive. And finally, one of the most important and seems to be one of the most effective things that are coming out of the research right now is the use of post-visit resources. And this is a fantastic opportunity to send prompts through emails, newsletters, social media kind of conversations, ongoing conversations with clients after they leave the park or after they leave the hotel in the mountains. And it's a great way to foster customer relationship management through that and continue the conversation about climate action. So I think I better leave it there, and I'm used up my time. Thank you so much.